Okay, great. I see that the recording is on. And again, welcome everyone to the Graduate Student Conference in the College of Education. And it's always every single year. It's a wonderful get together to see and showcase the research that our wonderful graduate students are embarking on, but also what's been so wonderful this year, but also in previous years, is the inclusion of students across the nation and even internationally. And that is an incredible strength of our college, that we're able to draw students literally from all over the world. So wherever you're logging in from, it could be the evening time, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning, because I know you won't be disappointed, right? So before we officially get started as well, for those of you who don't know me, and that's completely okay, I am Yoon Pak. I am professor and head of education policy, organization, and leadership. And before I lose track as well, just want to let you know logistically that after the end of Dr. Pacione-Zayas' presentation, we will have a few minutes for question and answers. So you might have some questions in mind already. I will do my very best to kind of field the questions towards the end. You can place them on the chat, or maybe you can have your hands raised virtually, or maybe Sanchari or Dora will let me know when I am out of line in that sense. But I appreciate the teamwork going into this. All right, so I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Cristina Pacione-Zayas, who received her PhD in Educational Policy Studies, now EPOL. She was appointed to the Illinois Senate in December 2020, and before joining the Senate, she was the Associate Vice President of Policy for Erickson Institute, an academic institution focused on child development, where she led Erickson's policy agenda to generate systemic solutions and equitable opportunities for young children, families, and communities. Dr. Pacione-Zayas is credited with establishing Erickson's Early Childhood Leadership Academy and Community Data Lab, two statewide initiatives designed for Illinois leaders to foster deeper understanding of the importance of a child's early years and how to apply child development science to policies that yield positive outcomes for children and families. Her prior experience at the Latino Policy Forum as Director of Education advanced policy informed by research and lived experiences of Latinx and immigrant communities across Illinois. Her service in Chicago Public Schools and Enlace Chicago built a track record for leveraging community partnerships, implementing restorative justice practices, and supporting the leadership of young people, parents, and educators. Dr. Pacione-Zayas serves on the Illinois Early Learning Council Executive Committee, Illinois State Team of the BUILD Initiative, and Title V Needs Assessment Advisory Committee for the state's federally mandated maternal and child health services. She previously served as board secretary on the Illinois State Board of Education, co-chaired the Kindergarten Transition Advisory Committee of the P20 and Early Learning Councils, and served on the governing board of the Illinois Network of Child Care Resources and Referral Agencies, Educational Success Committee of Governor J.B. Pritzker's Transition Team, and the Education Committee of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's Transition Team. She co-chaired the Puerto Rican Agenda of Chicago for 6 years, a nonprofit organization of local Puerto Rican leaders who influence policy for the self-determination of Puerto Ricans and provides political commentary on WGN-TV Chicago during election cycles. Okay, I don't know when she sleeps and I'm out of breath, but she is an incredible, and I am so deeply, deeply honored that we can have Dr. Pacione-Zayas with us here today. So without further ado, you are up, Senator, Doctor.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. All right. You guys got to check that. With the Zoom, I feel like that now becomes our introductory remarks. Really excited to be here with you this morning. It is like a homecoming for me to come back to U of I, even though it's virtual, and the College of Education, and see that the spirit and the legacy of transformative educational spaces is still in full effect, alive, and continues to fuel the work that I do. I'm not sure if you all are seeing this, but I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a delay, and I want to make sure that at least you are able to hear me okay. Okay, it's these hours that you never know how Zoom is going to work with you. All right, so I'm going to get us started here and start sharing my screen. Give me one moment, please. And want to make sure, let me get it in slide mode. It's taking just a second here. I think it is thinking here. So
Did we also just lose? Yeah, okay, we lost the senator.
We're lost,
Well,
yeah.
okay, we will wait a couple more minutes. We have been noticing more and more this week kind of Zoom challenges. So it is the nature of the way things work. And even during live conferences, equipment just do not want to work. So we just kind of wing it. But everyone is doing well. You're doing okay? Yeah, okay. The people working on the conference, you got some sleep? Or you will maybe after the conference is over. All right, very good.
I just wanted to, while the Senator comes back, wanted to say that the program for the conference is now up on the Moodle site and also the box folder. So if anybody wants to look at that, go there and check that out.
Great. Yes, please access those places for the program. And I'm just confirming, was the program sent out to all college faculty, staff, students? I'm seeing a nodding
I'm in
head.
the process of doing that right now. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Thank you. Great. Thank you, Kathy. Well, if some of you need to grab another cup of coffee, this would probably be a good time to do so. or if you want to share any great highlights to set us off on a nice weekend, that would also be appreciated.
I had to step away to get my coffee. What happened?
Yeah. We lost the connection.
You know, I always joke because now that I'm in the area of early child, well, previously in the area of early childhood, we talk a lot about executive functioning and self-regulation. And so being in these spaces, having moments like this are really great exercises in self-regulation and being able to kind of just go with the flow. And so I am going to move us along so that we don't have all of this, kind of craziness. And what I want to do, essentially, here we go. I think I'm going to roll with sharing my PowerPoint screen so that it doesn't, let's see. And I'm going to get into the slideshow mode. I think I just probably had too much going on my computer and it needed a break. Okay, it should be transitioning here. And ta-da, bam, here we go. Okay, so obviously I was just saying it's, really a incredible, moment to come back to U of I, to be here with you all in community. I wanted to begin our time together, acknowledging that those of us who are in Champaign, Urbana, and myself in Chicago, I want to acknowledge the land, and that in both places we are on occupied indigenous lands. In Champaign, you're on Kickapoo, Sioux, and Peoria land. In Chicago, I am on the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, Sioux, and Peoria land. And I know that we have, guests from outside of Illinois and perhaps even other countries. And I encourage you to check into the land that you are currently occupying. And I think it's important to do this, particularly I'm trying to get into the discipline of the practice whenever I give a talk, whenever I have a meeting where there's a gathering of us, that we acknowledge the history and the ongoing colonization of where we're sitting right now. And, particularly in our case, in the Illinois context, and of course, across the country and the world. And it's important to pay respect to elders, both past and present, by acknowledging their stewardship throughout the generations. And although this is simple and, some people have kind of critiqued it as performative, it's really my commitment to disruption. And you're going to find in my talk, I talk a lot about being a disruptor but being a purposeful disruptor, not just being a disruptor for the sake of disruption. And, in this particular case, I really want to, disrupt the tradition of erasure and of silencing of our Native American siblings, and honoring our shared humanity, continued presence, and the past contributions of Native Americans. And so I wanted to, try to make this talk interactive. And so, as we get started, I'd like for you all in the chat, while I'm going to go into the next piece, kind of just type in, what are your thinking about the theme of this conference, learning reconsidered. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to your scholarship, your practice? What is the one thing that kind of stands out to you, particularly as you reflect, all in the field of education? We have had a lot of time to really think through and reconsider what education looks like, feels like in the context of a pandemic, in the context of a racial injustice uprising, in the context of, really going into this next decade. And if you can just share a few words in the chat so that can give me a sense of where you're at this morning and what you've been pondering on the past few years, or the past year, I should say. So I want to give you all a little bit of background about myself. This is I'm going to tell a few stories throughout this talk, and this one is particularly related to my origin story, and how, that has informed, the context of my trajectory into the work I'm currently doing. And that really comes from the fact that I am the child of two organizers, community organizers, one who was born in Puerto Rico, but whose family had to leave when he was 4 because his brother was born without limbs. And the healthcare system in Puerto Rico was not going to be able to set him up to thrive. And so they came to Chicago in the 50s when there was mass migration of Puerto Ricans to Chicago during that particular period. They landed in Lathrop homes. If you're from Chicago, you know that that is public housing. And it's actually a historic landmark because of the architecture and some of the kind of historical elements of populations that had lived and occupied Lathrop homes. My mom is first generation Italian, and she, was one of 10 children. And she grew up in a context of, she really was kind of like the oddball. She really disrupted in many ways the concepts around, being a woman, a girl. She was under a matriarch that was very Catholic and ruled with an iron fist. And you did not leave the house until you were married. And you sure didn't leave the house to go live with your partner before you got married. And my mom did all those things. I definitely come from a tradition of, kind of bucking tradition, I guess you could say. And so I also had to put, a couple of my contextual pieces. You'll see the eagle there is Logan Square. My parents met at that's the Centennial Monument. My parents met at the Boys and Girls Club in Logan Square as after school instructors, and they worked their way up to become program director and executive director, and bam, they got married, and you see the little baby there. That's me. And so I grew up in the context of the Boys and Girls Club. I mean, for me, community was family. I understood that at a very early age, our collective humanity, our social responsibility to look out for each other, the power of the people being greater than the people in power. My parents took me everywhere. I was, at community events, I was at board meetings, I was at protests, those were, kind of my formative years, and really helped to kind of set the trajectory in terms of what I understood education to be, not schooling, but education. And that being rooted in community knowledge and the relationships, the bonds that you form with community in the struggle. And so, and you'll see there the Paseo Boricua, the iconic 50-foot steel flags that go over Division Street, which is kind of like mainland USA or Main Avenue for the Puerto Rican community. Paseo Boricua means Puerto Rican passage, I guess. But it's basically the context of the Puerto Rican community here in Chicago, and a lot of amazing work, and actually the subject of my dissertation. But that's for another story. I want to move us along. So I wanted to kind of give you another story, another contextual story for this talk. And I kind of, sum it up with this phrase that it's not about where you land, it's about what you do in the place you land. And the reason why I want to tell the story I want to talk about, it's pretty much exactly almost to the month. 20 years ago, I got an acceptance letter to be in the department formerly known as Educational Policy Studies, but now y'all are fancy, EPOL. And it was, to get in to the doctoral program there. And, I think about when I was considering graduate school and what I heard about the Educational Policy Studies Department, and particularly Dr. Anderson, who I know we finally called Doc. And, I remember I was just really attracted to the fact that I heard that the department, graduated the most Black and Brown PhDs. And I said, I have to be there. That is a space that I know I am going to have some affirmation, and I'm going to have some allyship and solidarity. And so I remember, I crack up because I remember when I had an introductory meeting with Dr. Anderson. And, I was telling him about my vision, my plans, what I wanted to do. And, in true Dr. Anderson form, he listened and, he graciously offered his time and answered my questions. And, I was just talking, I really wanted to be an educational documentary filmmaker. And in my mind, the plan was to not go to film school, but to really go deep into the training, the understanding, the history, the political and social context of education, so that I could imbue all of that into my cinematography and be able to tell fully three-dimensional authentic stories about the experience of education here in this country, particularly for communities of color. And I remember Doc really, he embraced that and he really welcomed that. And, I was truly appreciative of it because I did kind of think it was off the wall, but, I was like, hey, let me pitch it to him anyway and see what's going on. So I get, and I think what is interesting is that I really never had the intention of coming to U of I as an undergraduate, but I think about how the U of I experience has really set me up for the moment I'm in right now, and particularly the College of Education and the type of education I received while I was there, the collegiality, the company, the all of these pieces really played a role. And it leads me to the next story on being a disruptor. And Dr. Pak can totally attest to this because my first semester at the U of I EPS program was the semester when September 11th happened. And, we had class, I think it was the next day, history of ed. And I, showed up like everybody else, kind of just, conflicted, lots of emotions, trying to process the event. And, Dr. Pak said, does anybody want to talk about what happened? And I was like, yeah, please call on me. Let's go. So I just explained that I really felt very conflicted. There was part of me that was looking at the humanity side of what happened, all these deaths and how that was affecting their family or their loved ones. And, just that massive loss. But I was also really grappling with the political moment. And I was thinking a lot about the role that the United States has played in foreign policy, the imperialism, the colonialism, and all of this sort of being, coming to the head. And I just really was having a hard time kind of reconciling both of those perspectives. And I remember, I just candidly shared it. And I remember that there were several students in the class that were like looking at me crazy. And they were just like, well, if you have a problem with this country, why don't you go back to where you came from? And I was like, well, that's not anywhere because I'm staying right here. That's where I come from. And, it really, we had this kind of exchange. And I really give it to Dr. Pak because, she allowed for that space and for those diverging views to engage in the conversation, to have those uncomfortable moments. to reckon with all of that. And so it is a vivid memory for me, and it is also a touchstone for how we should think about having these types of conversations, encouraging in educational spaces. You know, if we all think alike, we're not going to really be able to tackle the solutions. And therefore, it's really important to allow those spaces, even if there is, you know, disagreement. So I want to, and like I said, I say all of this in the context of I never expected to be at U of I, but here I am. So I wanted to start with those two stories, and particularly as we're thinking about Learning Reconsidered. This is a Urie Bronfenbrenner is an American psychologist who, you know, is most often known for his ecological systems theory. And in early childhood, we speak to this a lot, where we talk about, it's really kind of the basic of, you know, nature versus nurture. And so you have a child who is born into a family, and there is a system of relationships that are within that family or in the caregiver setting. And that family, that caregiver setting is also nestled in a broader system. And that system is, you know, the neighborhood and the community and the schooling or the early care. And then you also have all of that in the context of culture and identity and peers and the neighborhood, the geography in which you live in. And so what this image is supposed to kind of, you know, illustrate for you is that you have all of these influences. You have, you know, children are born with particular dispositions, but it's also the relationships that they engage in throughout their development that also influence their development. It is the interplay of the environment plus the relationships and the disposition. And that is one thing that, you know, I constantly come back to when I'm thinking about learning, when I'm thinking about education and what young people and children bring to educational spaces and the primacy of relationships, because education does not take place without a relationship. And in all of my not only studying, but, you know, professional experience, that is the one baseline I always come back to, because if you don't have a relationship with a child or a young person in an educational setting, very little learning is going to take place. And that is one of the things to kind of always consider as we're thinking through this. So here we are, right? We're kind of at this crossroads. You know, this little virus, boy, I don't know if anybody knew what we were about to experience here. And, you know, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of seeing this little virus. But it really, you know, in many ways has unveiled what we've known for generations. And that is that, you know, there are social determinants of health that are inclusive of environment, of access to education, health, nutrition, exposure to violence, you know, systemic inequities. All of those things contribute to your health status, which also then determines in many ways your life trajectory. And so we know that COVID has disproportionately affected communities of color because of, you know, the historic inequities in access around high quality healthcare and the other social determinants of health. And so it has, you know, ravaged our communities in so many ways. And so here we are, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, and we're also having a reckoning with racial injustice, as, you know, we all watched the murder of George Floyd, and, you know, that sort of being the pinnacle of so many other murders that we have witnessed, particularly in the Black community. And so we're now at this place. And the thing is that this has always been going on. But all of a sudden now some more people are becoming aware of not only the injustice, but particularly how it's situated in the system and the structure. And this is not just a case of a bad apple. This is not just a bad actor. This is about a system and structure that protects this type of behavior against Black people specifically and people of color generally, and actually incentivizes this type of behavior. And so you have these kind of converging pandemics, you know, the regularly scheduled one, white supremacy, and then the one that came on through COVID-19. And what COVID-19 also unveiled for us is just how critical schools are to the livelihood of children and families, because immediately our schools became hubs for distribution of food, for the distribution of devices and educational resources and referrals for social service agencies. All of those things became very apparent to the public, and that there are so many different pressures and responsibilities of schools to attend to the basic needs of children, families, and educators. And while this has been happening, there has been a disproportionate decrease in investments in schools. And so all of this is coming sort of to a head, right, in this moment in time. So, you know, that kind of brings me to, so what do you do, right? Going back to that, it's not where you land, it's what you do with where you land, right? And, you know, as students, faculty, scholars in education, we all have a role to play in disrupting the status quo. And not just doing it to critique it, but doing it to transform it. And so I found myself on the State Board of Education, and I was, you know, at this point, back in June, I had been there almost a year and a half. But from day one, the moment I sat at that table in that first meeting, and they're asking me to approve contracts over $1 million with very minimal information about what this investment is going to yield, how this is actually have benefited children and educators and families, and how I just need to go ahead and flow with this, because this is what they call the consent agenda. So the system is set up for you to just go ahead, rubber stamp. And what I said from that first day I sat up there, I said, first of all, I really, on a process tip, I can't, because I really think we need to consider implementing a racial equity impact analysis for every single decision that we make, so we can assure that we are not facilitating additional burden and benefiting populations that historically have benefited at the cost of those who have been burdened. And I'd like to give you all some tools, because I have been working closely with the state and the Early Learning Council to implement a racial equity impact analysis tool in our early childhood decision-making processes. And so, you know, people were just kind of like, oh, that's, you know, that's kind of cute. She's being critical, so on and so forth, right? Well, every single meeting thereafter, I kept on asking for it. And they obviously did not adopt it. I had sent it to them. I offered them my help. But what I did do was I exercised the power of the question, so that when every single one of those decisions had to be made, I asked questions about, how are we defining success? Who stands to benefit? Who is burdened? What was the process we engaged stakeholders? What is going to be the material difference this is going to make in the lives of children and families? Can I tell you, they were so tired of me by the time I left that board. I know they're happy, but guess what? They're going to deal with me in the Senate. So fun times. But I wanted to show you all this particular article, because this was a moment, you know, like so many educational institutions, the State Board of Education decides to draft a resolution saying that we are going to end racial injustice. We're going to do everything we can in our power as a State Board of Education. And so they send me the resolution in advance. I read it and I say, look, you know, I have no problem with this commitment because this is obviously what I, you know, kind of intend to do in my work and what I've been bringing to the table. I said, but, you know, I really think that a statement is just going to be a performance. I have been asking you all now for 16 months to put together a process and an implementation strategy to vet and implement a racial equity impact analysis tool. And I think that that is the appropriate thing to come with, to say, we have been spending some time vetting this. This is going to be the structural change we make as a board, because as a board, we don't implement. We just make decisions based on policy, or we make decisions for policy, we allocate resources, and those are the powers that we have. And so if we don't have these guardrails in place, status quo is going to creep in, and guess who's going to benefit? So they, you know, I had this conversation with the chair, with the superintendent, and I just told them, I said, you know, I'm going to let y'all know, I'm going to make a public statement about this, because I just don't think we need to be having these conversations behind closed doors. I think it's really important for the public to know that we're grappling with how we operationalize our commitment. And so, you know, they thought by giving me the resolution to read, that it was going to, you know, bring me down, but guess what? Gave me a platform. And so it was needless to say, a very intense meeting. And this was one of the quotes that Chalkbeat had captured, because, you know, I made a commitment at that table from the very first day that I wasn't going to be there to just stack up my resume and make people feel comfortable. I was going to be there to really disrupt and transform this educational system, and be that person that starts to change the conversation, that then influences different behaviors. So, you know, as I said, I'm a purposeful disruptor. It's not just to disrupt. And we had some difficult conversations after that. You know, some people felt that my approach was too out of left field. I shouldn't have done that publicly. All of that. And I said, you all need to understand there's a purpose for all of this. We as board members are sitting around this table. We provide you cover as superintendent. I was appointed by the governor. Governor's out in these streets right now with the Black Caucus talking about it's not about protest, it's about progress. And what we are not going to stand for is X, Y, Z. And guess what? As a board, we have every single responsibility to make sure that we do the same. So what did that result in? And that's why I'm saying you just can't disrupt to disrupt when we're thinking about learning reconsidered, right? So what that resulted in is the superintendent, you know, had been working on this, but she said, you know, you obviously have created a lot more urgency and the moment is calling for it. And so what she had been doing since I had suggested is putting together a task force, a working group within the State Board of Education staff to vet various racial equity impact analysis tools to identify what would be appropriate, not only for the board to use, but for also their internal use, for work plans, for work streams, for how they make decisions, hiring practices, so on and so forth. And she went even further, and they explored how can we take existing data on the school report card that's submitted to us by all school districts and now make transparent what the equity journey is for every single school district. So not just you diversifying the curriculum, you are, you know, celebrating diversity and multiculturalism, but concretely, what are you doing substantively to really disrupt these systems and structures that center whiteness at the expense of everyone else? And so I wanted to kind of give you all that story to then talk a little bit about what happens when you do disrupt those systems and what comes in front of you and what you need to be looking out for. And there's a great article that I came across out of an education administration journal, and it really starts to outline what these racial equity detours are. Because now when you put stuff on the table and people make these statements that we're so committed to this and we're going to change our ways. Well, sometimes you need to name what diversion looks like so that you can then better come up with the solutions to mitigate the diversion. So I'm sure, there's plenty of you that have seen this in action. And in fact, I'd love to hear in the chat if there are explicit examples you'd be willing to share. But, we know that there's the pacing for privilege, right? To make sure that the comfort and interests of white people are centered. It's too radical to move that quickly. It's going to make people very uncomfortable. Well, that shows us what we're placing a benefit or a price tag on instead of true progress. The deficit ideology is all about, well, if these kids just would do this, it would be better. If they had more grit, if their mindsets were different, instead of actually thinking about the structure and the systems that reinforce the racist conditions they're experiencing in schooling. Or the celebrating diversity tour. We've seen this. Let's just, put together a little syllabus with some different, names and voices. And, we checked off the box because that's how we do it. Or the poverty of culture, right? I'm sorry, I skipped over the shiny new program. And I've been in this situation. I've been lead of a shiny new program, and let them work on that racial equity thing. That's so much, that's their work to do. And we know about the, culture, the poverty of culture piece, that tragic framework. And, what I do want to kind of differentiate between, because there's, in some of these frameworks, we talk about cultural competence and we talk about cultural proficiency, and those are important, but absent of the approaches like culturally responsive and culturally relevant and culturally sustaining, those are just anemic concepts. The cultural competence and proficiency, they do not really situate in the grounded piece around really looking at this from a structural perspective. And I think about the next one with the individualizing racism, and where it limits that, racism is only about interpersonal interactions. It's about biases. It's about attitudes and incidents. And it's really not about a system and structure in place that incentivizes this type of behavior, that promotes this behavior. And then the whole piece about it's about class, not race detour. And so conflating racial and class inequity to really diminish our focus on that. So what I also like about this particular article is that he provides us with 5 principles of equity literacy. And this is really instructive in our educational sense. We have to name the problem. We have to be really direct about that. I remember in having a conversation with Dr. Anderson actually about, how I was going about this disruption on the State Board of Education. He said, we need to take a page from the medical community. When there is a medical problem, you want a precise diagnosis to be able to then develop an intervention to heal, to address what the original cause is. You've got to go back to that root cause. There is the redistribution principle. This is kind of like simplified in a way. It's almost like a reparations kind of example. Like, how can we repair harm, redistribute resources for what we have historically subtracted? A prioritization principle, making this a priority. This is a prime feature of your work. This is not just an add-on, but this is where it's centered. And then the equity ideology in terms of constantly thinking about equity in its multiple dimensions. And then the fix injustice, not kids principle, right? This is really about counteracting that whole individual thing, individual racism piece, and, or the poverty of culture piece. So here's where we're at. I like to use this, this image. This is a grasshopper molting, you know, and because I feel like we are shedding our skin. We have an opportunity to rebirth, to reimagine, and not just stay in that exoskeleton. You know, the definition of this is that you have to shed the exoskeleton in order to grow, to keep on evolving. And so I want to kind of close us with a couple of thoughts, because transformation is on its way in the systems and structures. And I want to make sure you all are aware of what's happening at the state level. First, you know, when we think about educational systems, there are 5 core components: standards, curriculum, assessments, educator preparation, and educator evaluation. And Goldie Muhammad speaks about how all of those are very much centered in whiteness and who they obviously end up harming. And not only harming, you know, students and young people of color, but also harming white students, because in many ways they become socialized to continue to be oppressors, to be agents of colonization. And they too, their humanity is being robbed. And so what's happening at the State Board of Ed is a revision of the social science standards. Now, we'd argue that we'd want all the standards to be revised so that we can really think through, how do we integrate this better? And how do we integrate a racial equity lens? How do we integrate an anti-racism framework within this schooling system? But this is a start. On the curriculum side, House Bill 2170 passed, and you all may have been following the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus 4 Pillars work. And this was actually a result that came out of the protests over the summer. The Black Caucus engaged in a very disciplined strategy of hosting several hearings over months to really get at the root causes of 4 areas of criminal justice reform, educational opportunity, economic opportunity, and healthcare transformation, health and healthcare transformation. And House Bill 2170 is the education pillar that lays out a slew. I mean, you want to talk about an omnibus? There had to be like at least 40 different articles in this particular bill. It was like 500 pages that really tackled everything from birth through higher education, from looking at access to high quality early care and education, to kindergarten transitions, to developmental delays and screenings, to how we are revising our curriculum to have an anchoring in all of the historic and political knowledge that has been robbed of our schools. There's actually a provision in there to establish freedom schools. I mean, there's just so many different things, and I would encourage you to look that up because it's on the brink of being signed. And so we definitely need to make sure that the governor does the right thing on that. The assessments piece, you know that there's a big debate right now in terms of, are we going to proceed with administering the federally mandated state assessments as a part of the Every Student Succeeds Act? Well, you know who had to raise this issue back in August when I was on the board. I said, let's not waste time, y'all. Let's go ahead and apply for that waiver. Georgia has already done it. And there was a lot of hemming and hawing. Well, they don't, we don't know if they're going to allow us. There might be a transition in the administration. We don't know. And I said, let's show leadership. Let's draw that line right now. Let's say our children and our educators and our families have had enough. And what they don't need is to be running back to school to take an assessment to tell us stuff that we already know. And what we also don't need is to be taking assessments that are basically standardized towards whiteness. That's all it's telling us, is how we compare to whiteness. And so we engaged in a 6-month discussion around this, finally got State Board to issue a statement saying that if the Department of Education grants it, we will be submitting a waiver. I said, thank you. Took me 6 months, but hey. Being a disruptor works. So And then there was, you know, I'm sure that you all have heard a lot about the culturally responsive teaching and leading standards for institutions of higher ed and our teacher prep programs. That has been a 3-year process to really look at how do we better prepare teachers to be facilitators of knowledge, to be co-conspirators with young people, to be accompaniers of young people and children on their human journey, to reconsider the relationships between educators and students, to think about how systems of oppression creep into our schooling, all of those things. And then lastly, educator evaluation. We haven't made much headway on that. That's the next frontier. But I look to you all because obviously, you know, we're all in this work in the spirit of education, and we all take our different pieces. And what I want to close us with is a story that I always tell, particularly when my Erickson days, that actually comes from the Maasai tradition in Eastern Africa and Kenya, where people greeted each other. Instead of saying, "Hi, how are you?" the greeting was, "And how are the children?" And it was an acknowledgement that the children are a valuable asset in the community because they represent the barometer of community well-being. Because if the children are well, because you're looking for that type of response, all the children are well, then you know the caregivers are well. You know the environment is safe, it's clean, children can explore, all of those things. It's really, again, going back to that ecological approach and that holistic concept that we are all responsible for each other. And when we are thinking about reconsidering learning and reimagining learning, we need to come back to these principles, and we need to be steadfast in disrupting the systems and structures that maintain the status quo. And so with that, I am going to stop because I know Dr. Pak's looking at me like, we got 2 minutes. But I'd be happy to, you know, take any questions or comments or feedback.
Thank you so much for that. I have to say, ever since that very first day in my classroom, I knew you would be a great teacher for all of us in this true sense. So thank you for your wisdom, for your tireless energy, We do have a little bit of time. If there are some questions, maybe some of you can type that in the chat. But as you were also speaking, I was wondering, what can our grad students do to maybe become interns at the state level?
Oh, yes. What they can do is I will put, I'd love for that, actually. I'd love to either be a connector and or pull you in to assist. Because one of the things that I am doing in terms of a stakeholder engagement strategy is I'm launching these roundtables that are going to work as work groups, and they're going to help me articulate a people's agenda for my legislative strategy. And I have an education focused one, a health one, a housing one, a violence reduction, as well as a workforce and small businesses. And then I also have a youth council. And so all of them are going to help me with refining my policy priorities, reviewing bill language, and when, you know, appropriate, co-authoring legislation. But also I'm launching a popular education campaign on government. What is it? Why do we need to be a part of it? Why do we have a place in it? Why, you know, why should we have a seat at the table? But I'm having the youth council tackle that through we're going to use Instagram, we're going to use TikTok, we're going to, you know, we're going to go hard. So I'm going to put in the chat my chief of staff. Or actually, you know what I'll do? Even better. I'm going to put in the chat my my website, and you can sign up in the contact us, and you can indicate if you want to, you know, get involved or, you know, have one of these, you know, internships, whatever you may think. I'm going to, and I have a little bit more of a description here that I'm dropping in the chat on the policy table so that you can, or the round table, so that you can learn a little bit more.
That is wonderful. I can already see where every single department in the college can really help contribute to your vision that really is about everyone, and especially for our population who have been so underserved for generations. So thank you, Senator Dr. Cristina Pacione-Zayas, for this moment. I'm tingling because it's just wonderful. I think we don't have questions, but just incredible notes of thanks.
Well, I'll be back with you all for the lunch panel. So hopefully we can, dive a little bit deeper there. Thanks for also to putting in the chat how you've been thinking through Learning Reimagined. And I particularly love the comment that was speaking to how children with special needs or diverse learners, whatever, language we're using, how that has really transformed. I can speak to that with my son who is in kindergarten and he has an IEP, and I've really actually seen a lot of growth and progress with him that we were not experiencing in a traditional classroom. And don't even get me started about, there's a whole bunch of discussion about what schools, how being away from the traditional schooling system, particularly for boys of color, how that has really been transformative. But, that's a whole nother story. And I'm sure Chicago Public Schools will be upset with me if I go off on that too.
Well, hoping that this will be the first of many conversations that we have together. So thank you again, deeply.
Thank you. See you all soon.
All right, that concludes this keynote session, and please be sure to go to the next one. See ya.